It's a hard life for a child. There is no safety, no protection. You can be eaten by a bear, or killed by lightning, starved by cold, and crippled by bad weather, burned by heat, or eaten by frost. You can be chased by monsters, or trampled by stampeding animals, frozen by cold, or baked by heat. You can be crushed by a falling tree. You can be stabbed by a thorn. You can be burned by a fire. You can be drowned. You can fall into a well. You can be crushed under a rock slide. You can be killed in a flood. You can be murdered by a jealous husband. You can be blown to pieces by an exploding bomb. You can be attacked by a shark. You can be burned to death in a house fire. You can be cut in half by a saw. You can drown in your own vomit. You can die in childbirth. There are so many ways to die. So many ways to become food for animals, or for children, or for monsters that live under the bed, or to be burned up by heat, or frozen by cold. The world is full of things to kill you. There is nothing that will protect you. Miserable as she was, Dodger knew that was wrong. She had lessons and warnings. She had seen other children die in different ways. And there were the books of the great library, full of stories where someone had survived what had killed her friends. And more, those who had not only survived, but grown wiser from the experience. There were tales of people who had lost legs and then grown new ones in another place, and of others who had been turned into frogs and then had their transformations reversed, or of girls who had been raised by wolves. Dodger had seen such tales with her own eyes when she went to the Free Clan's camp to train as a warrior, and again, when she traveled the world on the library's business. She'd read them in her books, too. There was no reason to think she wouldn't live through something as dangerous as crossing a river, especially since she had her mother's gift of the river wings, and she was a good swimmer, better than most of the clan. No, the real problem was that she was an adult, not a child, and that meant she knew how much trouble there was in the world, and how little chance she would have to survive it if she became a slave again. If she could escape one master, she would probably be taken captive by another one. If she was freed by one clan, she'd be caught by another. Slave hunting was a major industry, and her family's name would make them a good target. She was still trying to figure out where she'd go once she left Josaric lands. She'd been traveling with Jory since they left home at about the same time. Jory knew people who lived in the mountains near Josaric lands. Dodge had been to stay with them once. But Jory couldn't travel without being caught, and there would be no place for her at their farm. So what will I do? Dodger thought. It was too late to get a book for the journey. She'd have to manage on her own. She hoped her friends could help her. Maybe even Q Jisco. Although he hadn't said much at all, just the way she wanted it. She'd like to know why he was following her. Was it because of the boy or because he had a reason to hate her family? She would never forget what he'd done to her, and if it became possible, she would pay him back someday. But if it hadn't been for him, she'd never have escaped. And I want to see that boy again. What will I do with him? I can't leave him to fend for himself. If he's like most street kids, he's hungry and scared half the time, and no good to anyone like that. He doesn't belong here. If he's lucky, someone will give him a meal and find him a warm place to sleep. But I can't do that. Well, she could leave him something to eat and put a coin in his hand. He might not even know how to spend it, but it was better than nothing. She sighed. There was nothing she could do now, except keep going forward. She bent down to scoop up another handful of mud, and went on. The sun had vanished behind the western hills before Dodger reached the end of the river, and she still had to walk through the next town before she reached the mountains where she wanted to go. It was late afternoon when she finally climbed a steep ridge that led to the high crags and snow-covered peaks where her friends lived. The air smelled sharp and cold as she crested the ridge. She took a moment to breathe it deep into her lungs, then began to look for the trail her friends had made across the ridge when they'd visited to take away the last of Dodger's things after her family had sold her as a slave. She had found the trail last year when she came looking for them, but since then the wind had erased some of her friends' marks. Her foot slipped on wet rock and Dodger grabbed for a sapling to break her fall. Her fingers clutched bark instead, and she heard her own gasp of pain. For a moment she hung in midair, dangling above a drop to a pile of boulders below. Her arms strained to hold her weight. She forced herself to relax. She had fallen off rocks in her youth and was more careful now. She didn't want to lose the only chance she'd ever have to see her friends again. With great effort, Dodger brought herself up against the tree again, using it to brace herself as she slowly eased her weight off her hands. The bark bit into her fingers, but she held on with grim determination. She forced her mind to stillness and looked around for the path her friends had left, searching for a trail that was gone. It was hard, but Dodger forced herself not to panic as she realized that the marks were gone. She let go of the tree and hung from her hands again, but this time she let go with her toes as well, scrabbling for purchase on the rock face. It took all her strength, but finally she got enough purchase to climb up onto a ledge and then to a wire area of flat ground that was covered with scrubby trees and bushes. Dodger pulled herself up onto solid ground and stood there panting and shaking with relief. She bent over and braced her hands on her knees, feeling as if her insides were being torn apart. It's all right, Dodger thought, trying to convince herself of it. The scratches hurt and she had scraped her palms, but her friends had made the same climb many times, and she wasn't going to die because they didn't make the same trail every time. Dodger took a few steps and stopped abruptly when she realized she was barefoot. She'd forgotten her shoes in her rush to escape her family's house. Well, maybe no one will notice I'm missing them. She remembered a cave where she could get warm and dry until her feet healed and looked for it now. And she remembered that it was on the other side of the mountains, and she'd have to cross those too. Dodge just stood still for a long moment, thinking about how to get across the mountains. Then she saw the trail again, a faint line of broken twigs leading to the top of the ridge and down the other side toward the valley beyond. Dodger walked toward it slowly. The trail grew fainter as she went. Either no one had used it in a while, or it was made by something large enough to crush it flat or break it completely. Dodger kept walking as she tried to remember where the path had started and how far it ran before it vanished. She could feel the pressure of its loss behind her eyes, as if someone were holding something over them, waiting for her to cry or scream so that they could strike her in the face with it. She was so deep in her own thoughts that it was several steps before Dodger noticed that someone was following her up the trail toward the mountain's top. Her first thought was that it was her father's men come for her again. She turned to run, but saw no one. A few moments later, she heard a horse snort and whinny. A white horse, with a rider in a dark green cloak with gold embroidery on the sleeves and collar. A cloak Dodger recognized all too well as the kind worn by Kujisco's men. Dodger! Kujisco called out! Stop! Stop and talk! Dodger stopped and waited. She took the knife from her belt and held it in both hands, ready to throw at the man on his horse if he attacked her again. Dodger, Kujisco said, looking down at her as he rode slowly toward her. Please forgive me. No. Dodger didn't take her eyes off Kujisco as he came closer. He looked as miserable as she felt. His clothes were damp with snowmelt and mud, his face streaked with dirt. He rode up next to her and reined his horse in, then swung down from his saddle and approached Dodger slowly on foot, as if afraid to get too close to her. His hands hung at his sides. He was taller than Dodger, but she matched his stride easily, letting him walk between her and the cliff's edge, while she kept the knife in both hands before her and ready for use. Please, he said again, I have to tell you something. Tell me later, Dodger said, if I don't kill you first. I had no choice, Kujisco said, keeping his hands still and his eyes lowered as he walked closer to Dodger. I'm sorry. What about my friends? Dodger said, though it was hard to speak around the lump in her throat. Are they dead? No, Kujisco said. They're alive, for now. He sounded tired. Dodger noticed. She took a chance and looked at him more closely. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I need help, he said quietly. I can pay you, but not for long, I promise you that. If you won't help me, I'll go to someone else. Dodger frowned and thought about it. Kujisco was telling the truth. He couldn't have come out of the mountains without money. He wasn't lying to her. He just needed help he couldn't pay for himself. Dodger knew a lot about the workings of cities. That was what happened when your father was a duke who ruled over dozens of small villages and cities in 3 lands. She knew what life was like for those who had no money and no power. She knew what happened when they tried to buy food with coins stolen from a rich man's purse, or when they tried to bribe the watchman on a gate to let them into a city without paying the tax on entering the city limits. If she turned Kujisco down, he'd be lucky just to be able to steal food from garbage piles. If he went to the authorities, they would probably hand him over to the guard for trial and punishment. Or they might just kill him in prison if they didn't care if he lived or died. That was why people who didn't have power or wealth had to have friends like Dodger's. Friends who would help them when they were in trouble and who wouldn't betray them later to save themselves. You want to go somewhere, Dodger said. I can take you there, but I won't do it for money. I don't need money, Kujisco said, smiling crookedly as he looked at Dodger's knife hand. I can pay you in other ways. I'll take that bet, Dodger said, smiling back at him. Let's go. She led him down the hill, past the cave, she remembered. along a reach, and then down a steep slope toward the trees where her friends lived. Dodger watched Kujisco's face carefully as they walked. She hadn't realized just how much she'd missed him until she saw his face again, though his clothes were different now. When they reached the cave where she had stayed with her friends, she stopped and looked back at him.
"Here's the path," Dodger said.
"Where will it lead?" Kujisco asked.
"I don't want to go any farther than I have to."
"You don't have to," Dodger said, "but I think we're going there anyway." She took a last look at him, then went into the cave with the others, leaving Kujisco alone in the dark.